While the choir's coming down, I'll ask you to turn to Judges chapter 6, the Old Testament. This Sunday and the next 2 weeks, we're going to look at Gideon out of Judges. It's interesting. There's 7 different judges recorded in that book. Gideon is the centerpiece, and so it's kind of a chiastic or a circular pattern. So it's in the middle. The first half of the story matches the prologue. The second half of the story matches the ending or the epilogue of the story. And so it's the center point and the pivot within the book itself. And you're going to hear these issues of idolatry as part of the story, both internal and external. And today's dealing with kind of the external part. And so we'll deal with Baal a little bit. The other part is we're going to talk about the Midianites. The Midianites were who God has turned the Israelites over, and they are oppressive to the children of Israel at this point because they haven't been following God. But there's this mixed history with Israel and the Midianites. They're descendants of Abraham. In Genesis chapter 25, Moses actually dwells with them, and you see that in Exodus for a while. But then they oppress the Israelites at least 2 different times in the Old Testament. And so there's this mixed history with them about who they are and where they are. Let's listen at Judges, and we'll start with verse 11, chapter 6. It says, "The angel of the Lord came and sat down under the oak in Ophrah that belonged to Joash, where his son Gideon was threshing wheat in the winepress to keep it from the Midianites." All right, so it tells you something a little bit about how oppressive they are. Okay, so anytime they planted fields and things, they had to hide the harvest from the Midianites and Amalekites that they would just come in and take it. And so literally Gideon is hiding with where they would be taking the oats, and where they thresh them outside, they would throw them up in the air and the wind would blow the chaff away, and then the good wheat would come back to the ground. He's having to do that inside, which means the air's not blowing. It's got to be much harder when he's doing that. But that's what they're trying to separate, the chaff and the wheat when they're there. But it also tells you something about what is happening, how difficult it is for them. So in verse 12 it says, "Then the angel of the Lord appeared to Gideon, and he said, 'The Lord is with you, mighty warrior.'" Listen to these next words. Gideon says, "Pardon me?" Like, who are you talking to? Or if you go back to my childhood, "Willis, what you talking about?" And so he's going, "Pardon me, my Lord. But if the Lord is with us, why has all of this happened to us? Where are all of his wonders that our ancestors told us about? When they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hands of the Midians.'" I got to be careful. I want to deal with those doubts and questions. We'll come back to that in just a minute. But yet, in the midst of that, God sees Gideon for who he is. And God sees who we are and who we can be. He knows exactly who Gideon is. Gideon may not see himself as a warrior yet at this point. He may see himself even more as a farmer, because where we see him is still working for his dad. And we're only going to see 3 or 4 chapters of of Gideon here in the book of Judges? Maybe just 3. We see this little glimpse of him. But God saw his whole life. He knew what was before him and what was after him. He knows who the warrior is. He knows who the leader is. He knows who has the strength in the midst of what is a horrible situation. One of the most oppressive times for Israel. He says in verse 12, he called him that mighty warrior. And then he tells him in verse 14, he said, I'm going to lead you, I'm going to let you lead us over the Midianites. So the Lord turned to him and said, and you go in the strength that you have. He said, to save Israel out of the Midian's hands. And I'm not sending you. He basically says, if you go by yourself in your own power, in your own strength, and in your own way, he says it's going to be a failure. But yet he knows who's in front of him. God knows exactly who's in front of him, and he knows exactly what he needs. He sees it. He understands it. Last year there was a TV show, and it was on Paramount. Kay and I watched it. It was the character's name is a true character. He was a black slave. His name was Bass Reeves. He also was one of the first U.S. Marshals who was an African American. He fought in the Civil War. He went from Salem to fight in the Civil War. Was really good with a gun, and ultimately he moves from bounty hunter into assistant marshal or deputy to a full-blown U.S. Marshal. And he was equipped, Bass Reeves was equipped for that moment in time of both who he was personally to overcome the things he would. You can imagine being an African American trying to become a U.S. Marshal after the Civil War was not a spot, even out west. This happens out west. Was challenging racially. He has to have the strength to see that happen and actually have a wife and a family, because the reality is those who God calls, he equips. Those who he sets off in place and in motion for certain things in their life, God gives them those skills to happen. I was just thinking, you should start to think about Paul. Paul's ability and who he was. It took somebody like him who could understand, and he says, I was a Pharisee's Pharisee. He knew the law. He knew their ways. If he was going to deal with them on the backside. He had the education and the ability to communicate very well. He also had great strength and endurance, too, because he was shipwrecked at least 3 times. He has trouble with his eyesight, and he will face persecution. The way Paul left most towns was he was run out of town. Every time he's run out of town, he runs to someplace else to tell that gospel story. I think about the 12 disciples, and I start to think about who they were as characters. You know, Peter has this strength to step forward. He's older and married as a disciple, but he has this strength and leadership. But we also know that at times he opens his mouth and puts his foot in it a few times. We see him with that strength to step out onto the water and go, Lord, I'll walk to you. One of the other leaders out of that is John, who's somewhat timid. He's one of the youngest disciples. It's interesting. God not only called John to give him strength, but I think he called his brother James. But remember, they're called the sons of thunder a little later too. Okay? And so he started to put these people together. Thomas, we always remember the doubting Thomas, but Thomas is this one who's this encourager, and he calls forth and lifts up people. We see his ministry go as he travels beyond. He lifts up and has this strength because he's the one who said right before Jesus was crucified and Jesus is headed back into Jerusalem. It's Thomas who says, if Jesus is going, let's go, boys, even if we die with him. That's my redneck E's interpretation of that statement. But he does say, let us go with him. Let us go and die with him. That is who Jesus put together. And so sometimes when all of a sudden when we're called out into these spots and in these places, we forget that the God who made us and created us, and he who knows the number of our days, knows exactly who we are. He knows where our struggles are. He knows where our family is ill or where there's been tension in them. He knows all that. He said, and that's who I call. When God calls us to the task, he will be faithful to equip us and to give us the tools to reach our goals and his. Now let's see if I can deal with those doubts for a minute. Because I think most of us have these moments. Is how do we deal with our doubts? And Gideon in 13, he says, wait a second, Lord. Pardon me? Really? Where have you been in the midst of all of this? Do you know how long we have been oppressed? And by the way, Judges is this, I told you it was 7 different judges, and the cycle is over and over, right? Israel cries out because it is oppressed. A judge is provided. Israel is called as like, hey, have you forgotten of what it means to follow us and what it means to follow God, what that looks like? The children of Israel respond and become faithful for a small period of time. And then they find themselves not being faithful. And God says, if you're not going to be faithful, let me remind you. And he gives them over to be oppressed. And so there's this cycle, and sometimes I hate to say it, you see it in people's lives, but the children of Israel saw it over and over. This one book, there's 7 different stories about it, of how that works. And so Gideon says, it's been a long time. He said, I had to hear this from my forefathers, not from my dad. That's how long they've been struggling. So we see that, and I think in our own lives we're like, Lord, I've been praying for the same thing over and over. I'm asking for something to happen, and how do we deal with it? And I start to... So oftentimes I think people tell us to never doubt. They said you should never doubt. I see Bible characters that we raise up and we cheer and we preach about who have doubts. And we go, why did that happen? How did that happen? I have to understand. Let me give you the flip side of this. And then I'll point out Gideon's. You think about the people who doubt in and around Jesus and in his ministry. Over and over, when those people are doubting, I believe they're doubting and going, we're not going over there, we're leaning on our own strength. And Jesus is rough with them. He says, you going to follow me? Don't worry about your family. Don't worry about burying the dead. Hey, come on, let's go. And they're looking, in the midst of their doubt, they're looking for an excuse to not follow Jesus. When the Pharisees start going back and forth with Jesus over laws and rules, and he goes, you worried about that, or you worried about following? Jesus is brutal to those who doubt. And many times, it tells us the crowds got so big, and then all of a sudden when the crowds get too big around Jesus, he lays out really hard teaching and the crowds thin out. Okay? The reality is that Jesus knows their heart. I believe that Gideon is looking, he's like, I want assurance to know that I'm following the true God. I've been through this part of my life where I haven't seen God move. We haven't seen the presence of God in our lives. He goes, I just want to make sure, Lord. Will you help me with that? We see this several different times in the Old Testament, and God honors that. He wants that assurance. He goes from, give me that, give me some assurance, to an all-in Gideon. Let's keep reading in verse 15. Now Gideon's going to, verses 15 and like through 17, he has this, he's like, I'm not sure about I have the right strength, I'm the right person for this. He says, pardon me, Lord, but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest of Manasseh, and I am the least in my family. Sounds like Moses when God calls Moses out. He goes, really? I stutter. We hear these same things, and he has this, like, just a second, Lord. And then he says, I will be with you, and I will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive. We struggle at that point. By the way, I would tell you Judges moves probably from like a PG-13 to a really heavy R by the end of the book about how the judgments come down. Gideon replied, he said, now if I have found favor in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. And the Lord says, I'll wait until you return. And so all of a sudden, Gideon goes and he gets a young goat and he gets some flour and he makes him some bread and broth and meat. It tells us in verses 18 and 19. So he brings out that offering and he sets it beside the angel of the Lord in 20. He said, the angel of God said to him, take the meat and unleavened bread and place them on the rock and pour out the broth. And Gideon did as so. And then the angel of the Lord touched the meat and the unleavened bread, and with the tip of his staff that was in his hand, fire flared from the rock, consuming the meat and the bread. And the angel of the Lord disappears. And then Gideon realized that it was an angel of the Lord. He exclaimed, he goes, Sovereign Lord, I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face. You asked for it, Gideon. You asked to be assured. And God has showed himself because he knows who you are and he's called you for this moment as he calls us. And the angel of the Lord said to him, peace, do not be afraid. You're not about to die. And so then Gideon built an altar to the Lord there, and he called it, the Lord is Peace. To this day, it stands in Ophrah. And so all of a sudden, he's had this identified as who he is, because God is the giver of peace in our times of trouble. No matter the ups and the downs, he provides it if we'll seek it and ask for it. It's interesting. He's going to do this, and God's going to say, okay, we got to take the next step. In verse 25, he said, in that same night, the Lord said to him, he said, take the second bull from your father's herd, the one 7 years old. Tear down your father's altar to Baal and to cut down the Asherah pole beside it. And he said, I want you to build a proper kind of altar to the Lord your God on top of that height of the Baal altar, the stones they had made for Baal piled up. And he said, using the wood of the Asherah pole, you cut down and offer the second bull of the burnt offering. The Midianites and all the people around, they worship Baal. There's this external idolatry that they're facing and they're living in. They're getting caught up in. Because it tells us in the next set of verses that it's interesting. Gideon comes and tears down the altar and destroys Baal's altar and builds an altar to Yahweh, to the Lord, his God, the God of the promises, the God of his forefathers, the one that he had heard about. He builds it on top of it. But you know when he does it? He doesn't do it during the daytime. Why do we do things at night and in the dark? To hide. So that nobody else sees us, right? For the God who showed himself to Gideon, who's called him, has given him this assurance. And he said, you are the God of peace. But I'm still afraid. And by the way, where he's tearing this down, it's on Joash's property. And it's his dad's place. And by the way, I thought growing up, I'll tell you, Mom and Daddy's place, my grandparents' place, if somebody showed up on it, it's still my place. Okay? It was. And so he goes, I can't even tear, I have to go at night even to tear down something from somebody else's God. And he builds it at night. God doesn't want us to be, he wants us to have strength. He wants us to have courage. He wants us to be at peace. Because it's interesting, he wants us to function without fear. In verses 28 and following, the community comes and goes, what happened out here? What happened to this altar that we built and was ours, and even though it was on your place, it's shared community. His dad stands up for him. He said, basically, he says, if Baal can't defend himself, y'all might as well go jump off a cliff. Baal isn't worth it. Baal would have been able to defend his altar. That's what Joash basically says in the next few verses. And so, how are we responding to God, who asks us to be, just don't be afraid. Don't be weak. You may be weak in your own strength, just as the angel of the Lord told Gideon. He goes, you go off and try to defeat the Midianites by yourself. Not too good. He said, God says, don't be afraid. You may be weak, but God is strong. I guess that's part of my challenge, is asking you to pray to see God move, that we might see somebody come to know the Lord and share the gospel. I want us to do it and understand that it's not, we're responsible for acting and being faithful to follow God. But we're also even more responsible for seeking God and asking for God to be the strong hand, to give us that strength and endurance, that ability and courage to speak. Don't be afraid, people, what it means to follow God. Because when you are faithful, remember my magnets and the nuts this morning? When you're faithful, people will see God working in you and through you. And they will be drawn just as much to that same God. That's my prayer for us today. Let me pray for you. Lord, in a time where it is easy to be afraid, may we have strength because of who we are following. Lord, let us live at peace with you and at strength following you. Lord, we thank you and we love you for your word and for your calling, that we might see Jesus come. Amen.